All right. I'm really excited to have George Peppou on the podcast. George, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
You are the CEO of Vow, which I think a lot of people in the future food space know of because you guys have been pretty adventurous with the types of cultivated meats you're creating. But for those who are not familiar with the company at all, what is the elevator pitch or description you tell people at parties, like what you do?
So the very simple version is we use cultured meat technology to invent meats that don't currently exist,
Mm,
that people like me that already eat meat choose selfishly in similar occasions. So to give you an example of what that looks like, in Singapore right now, we have several products on market, including our quail foie gras. That's not an animal product which exists. That's something we've invented specifically for the Singapore market. And it is a completely unique food experience that often meat eaters are trying and going back to restaurants to purchase again because it's so distinctive and so unique. A few years ago, we did something which is a lot of people have heard of. We made a woolly mammoth meatball,
yeah.
which was a
Yeah.
sort of
I think that's
tongue-in-cheek version
that's
of
really
this.
what kind of put you on the map. It was a little bit
Yes.
of a publicity stunt, I think, self-admitted, right?
Oh, completely. It was I had one journalist, and they sent me an email being like, "We've got you. This is just a cynical publicity stunt." I was like, "It literally says that in our press release. We're not pretending it's anything else. It's like purely a way of getting people talking about what can be." And then when we come out with cultured quail a year down the track, it suddenly seems really normal and really
Yeah.
non-adventurous compared to a woolly mammoth meatball. And so that was the idea of like do something which is just outrageous to get people thinking about these absolutely wild extreme
Yeah.
scenarios, and then do something which would have otherwise seemed pretty adventurous, but suddenly feels quite mundane.
I had at my event in Seattle Nathan Myhrvold on stage,
Yep.
and he, at the time, being a pretty forward-thinking guy, was talking about, hey, at some point I want to have, or we can possibly make a Brontosaurus burger. I think it was like 2016, but so that was pretty early on. But I think you guys beat him to the prehistoric DNA in some sort of edible food. But
Actually, if,
we'll come,
that's a
we'll
good
cir-
idea. And if you're listening,
yeah,
send me an email. We should definitely collab. I've been wanting to do a T-Rex burger for a really long time, so
yeah,
let's work
yeah.
on that together.
He might listen. I can connect you guys. But yeah, so I think let's circle back to all what you've been doing because I want to go back to the beginning on this idea of you creating this company. Have you always been someone who's been in future food? What kind of lit the light for you on cultivated meat? I need to get in and start a business here.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story. So when I was, when I finished high school, I was very interested in being a chef and quite
Mm,
interested in science as well. And I ended up doing both. So I worked full time in kitchens while I was studying a biochemistry degree at Sydney University. I kind of gave the chef thing a go. I did stage in a bunch of high end restaurants, and I realized it was not something that I could do long term. And so I ended up getting a very strange job as an inventor, ironically working for Nathan Myhrvold's company, Intellectual Ventures.
oh,
Never
okay.
actually met Nathan
Okay.
or spoken to him, but I was working for Intellectual Ventures specifically in their food and ag tech portfolio. So working
Oh,
with
cool.
groups like Pepsi on inventing new
Yeah.
snacking or starch recovery, through to groups like the Australian meat industry on objective carcass measurement. So a really wide range of different things in the food and agriculture space. And, the idea stage was very exciting. And working with Intellectual Ventures, you get this blank sheet, and that was really, really cool. But then actually turning those into things which could be used in a factory was harder, and we ultimately didn't see the proof of concepts turn into commercialized products as much as I would like. So they moved more into like a bit of R&D management for a while.
Mm,
That was
yeah.
slow and incremental, or slower and more incremental than I was interested in. Then into more strategy consulting stuff, which was boring because it's hard to get incumbents to change. And then ultimately I was like, well, if I want to try to
Yeah.
change the food system, the easiest way to do that is building new businesses from scratch that enshrine the things that I think matter in their business model from the ground up. And ultimately that's sustainability and equitable access to
Yeah.
high quality, tasty, nutritious food. So I founded a
I
startup
feel like I
accelerator.
real quick also I feel like
Yeah,
a
sure.
lot of people went on this journey. I think Paul
Yes.
Shapiro's was similar. He was basically advocating for better treatment of animals, et cetera. And
Yep.
then ultimately said, I can't change it unless I start something. But real
Yes.
quickly on the Nathan Myhrvold thing, I don't know if you ever visited the Intellectual Ventures headquarters in Bellevue, but I felt like I was going to maybe not make it out there alive because I'm walking through and one side he's going, we're reinventing, we're using spent nuclear rods over here.
Yes.
Over here we have like some deadly disease that we're trying to contain. And it's like, he's definitely a mad scientist.
Oh, 100%. And it was really interesting working because the Intellectual Ventures had all these different streams, and
Yeah.
the place you would have visited was where they were like building things entirely.
Yeah.
They were kind of picking problem areas and just being like, we're going to invest in smart people and just let them run and solve. How do you develop a laser to shoot mosquitoes out of the sky?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it was just wild stuff. I was working on the other side, which is the invention development fund, which was essentially figuring out what they thought was going to be important 10, 20 years down the road and inventing into that space to try and accelerate those particular fields. And so it was much more the front end of the ideas and much less of the actual execution. I would have loved to work in that mad scientist lab and actually get to like kind of drive things the whole way through. Because it's like the ideas stage is fun, but where it gets really interesting is where that meets reality and you actually have to
Yeah.
make something work, not just once, but work reliably in a production environment. That's much, much tougher.
So you made the decision at some point that to affect change, you needed to maybe do it by building a company. And it sounded like your first company was not Vow. You did a company before
It
that.
wasn't a company, but I'd set up a startup accelerator
Okay.
specifically for food and ag tech businesses, and it kind of gave
Okay.
me the exposure to that early stage. I specifically didn't want to be a founder. I knew a lot of founders, and it looked really, really, really tough and very sort of all. It's hard not to get absorbed into your company, and so I didn't want to necessarily do that, but ultimately through that accelerator I just found a problem which I didn't believe anyone else was solving the way that I thought would drive the impact I wanted to see in the world. And once that thought was in my head, it was very hard to think about doing anything else.
And was this a food and beverage accelerator based out of Australia, or what was
That's right.
the?
Based in
And
Sydney.
okay, and you now that you're on the other side of the equation, on the other side, is it as hard as you expected it to be? As you are you? Did you make a mistake?
So I thought it was going to be horrific, like so horrifically hard. No one should ever be a founder, and it turned out it was actually harder than I thought.
Okay.
I think there's something about the level of difficulty is a really good filter where people only build something and like will it into existence when it's something they have so much conviction in that they just can't do anything else with themselves. And
Yeah.
so it's been interesting to see peer founders that started companies around the same time, like who has just had that ability and persistence to just keep punching through walls year after year, and who just sort of fell out of love with what they were working on and just ended up doing something different.
So let's talk about the original concept for Bao. Was someone talking about the idea of trying to make meat that no one is producing? What was the idea that you decided you needed to really bring to life?
So the core thesis when I started the company was there was going to be two-way, but actually maybe taking a step back, there was like a technology question. So it's like animals are a huge resource bottleneck in food production. What technology is going to displace some of that demand? Then there was a product question. And so on the technology, that's where I spent the first 6 months looking at everything under the sun, literally and figuratively. I looked at, can you make animal agriculture more sustainable? That seems like the easiest option. The answer is not particularly or not very efficiently. Can you make plants taste like meat enough that that's sufficient for meat eaters? No. Can you use other sources like the solar foods, proteins, where you're skipping traditional
Yeah.
agriculture entirely? Yes, but that's not going to give you the sophistication, the biochemical sophistication in meat. And so it sort of left, okay, well, the last man standing is cell culture. And as someone that had done a little bit of cell culture, it is tough. And I did not think it was commercially viable. I did not think it was scalable, but it seemed like the only way to create the biochemical complexity of animal products. So that was then the technology choice. At the time, I looked at the industry, and there were a bunch of companies. This is end of 2018, early 2019. There were a
Yeah.
bunch of companies working on chicken, beef, and pork. My thesis was they would come to market probably 2020, 2021, and they'd take a lot of the weight of market education. And so we'd come to market 2023, 2024 with these distinctive products that would be essentially second wave products that would
Mm.
offer, would be offered into a category which had already existed or was already in existence. What And then the core thesis on the products themselves was make things that animals can't, that meat eaters are choosing selfishly. So starting off in luxury fine dining with products that are just pure novelty and exclusivity, but then ultimately move down to creating things in supermarkets. Like the thing that I constantly come back to of like, the reason I started Vow is I basically want something I can use like beef mince that tastes like Wagyu beef burgers, that has the nutritional profile of salmon, but with the iron of beef liver. That would be like fantastic. I'd eat that like every single day. It would make life so easy. And if it lasts 4 weeks in the fridge, I'd just stock up once a month and it would be great. So it's like
Yeah.
that's the type of thing that I want to see in the world and I think would be compelling to lots of people like me, especially if it's the cheapest option, which is our goal. And so that was a long-term view. How do you create that? Well, you need a bunch of different cells from different species that you're going to grow, then mix together to create that final product, to blend the sensory profile and nutritional profile.
Mm. Yeah.
How do you get to that point where you need to build a library of cells to figure out what's tasty, nutritious, and easy to grow? How do you then take that to market? You pick something which is easy to grow, tastes good, and is interesting enough that it's going to find a place on those high-end menus. And that's ultimately what led us to our first brand, which is Forged, which is always intended to be that luxury high-end brand that's serving that top end of the food service market. And then ultimately other ones will support, other brands will offer different value propositions in different markets.
Interesting. So I know that your first consumer-facing brand was Forge, and that's the foie gras,
That's
and
right.
right. And do you plan to offer other meats under that high-end brand?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of different products that we've already got. So we've got the foie gras, the parfait. We have a tallow, which is the fat that cooks off the foie gras, which we serve as candles, which is a little fun twist. And so you light the candle and you dip bread in it. It's like a very fun little sort of multi-sensory experience. And we've got the broth, we've got charcuterie, which we're testing at the moment, and we have a fish fillet texture that we're working on as well. We also have other species that we want to launch as well. Towards the end of 25 or maybe early 26, but under that Forge brand, very much so.
And you announced, I think, about 2 months ago, I think it was November or early December, that you are now moving into your second country, because I think you were in Singapore and I think you
Yes.
started serving in Hong Kong, correct?
That's correct. It started off with a parfait, the quail parfait, just with a couple of venues, really just as a way of getting a sense of that market and consumer acceptance in Hong Kong. We also have, or hoping to be sharing some news on Macau in the next month or two. But the big market that we're most excited about is Australia. This is all public. We've been through the final public comment period for the food standards ANZ, the food regulator here, which is Australia and New Zealand. Hopefully in the next few months, I'll be able to share some news publicly on the next stages of that approval. But we remain on track in the Australian and New Zealand market, which is obviously very close to home for us.
That would be the first, right? I don't think any
That's right.
cultivated meat companies serving in Australia or New Zealand, and that
That's right.
would be both countries, right? Because it's a joint.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
it's interesting because the market's been struggling. I feel like a
Yes.
lot of companies have gone under. You've seen some bigger companies make announcements around infrastructure and kind of big production factories that they had to roll back and pull back
Yes.
on. Where are you in this journey in terms of scaling?
Yep.
And it doesn't seem like there's been at least outwardly facing a lot of struggles for you guys compared to what I've seen from the others in the industry. Can you talk about your journey there? What's going on?
So, I mean, there's plenty of struggles. It's just we definitely approach things very differently. So, we have two factories. We have Factory One, which is one 2,000 liter production line using off the shelf pharmaceutical process equipment. It's terrible in general. It's expensive, poorly engineered, unreliable. So, when we saw that, we said, okay, well, we want to build a second factory, but using equipment we've designed ourselves. And so, Factory Two, which is the building that I'm in now, we currently have two large scale lines, one 15,000, one 20,000. The 20,000 in particular is like completely designed in house. We had the tank built to our spec. All the piping was designed and welded in house. We have a team of welders here which do all of that. The software that runs on it was written in this building. So it's completely vertically integrated equipment design. And the reason for that is the way that pharmaceutical cell culture operates is just totally not applicable to food cost structures. And the only way to make cell culture at food cost was to go back completely to a blank sheet of paper and re-engineer every aspect of the factory from scratch. We don't operate in a clean room. The bioreactors are sitting out in literally a shed. There is some very light particulate filtration, but it's essentially a dirty space. But because they're sealed systems, that's not an issue for operations. We have food processing space, which is segregated with proper air handling, where there is some food exposed to the atmosphere, of course, but the production sits out on the factory floor. We use culinary steam. We use a low purity oxygen as opposed to 99.9% oxygen. Every single utility has been kind of considered from first principles. Every component of production systems have been designed from scratch around cost. And there's still a hell of a long way to go. The vision is completely operator-free factory where you thaw directly into a 200 liter reactor, and then an operator doesn't touch it until it's packaged until it sort of moves into food processing. That's the goal. We have a hell of a long way to go there to get there, but that's exactly the engineering roadmap we're working against. And the cost structure of this facility is low. We've spent less than 10 million so far to get to this point, including upstream and downstream processing and all utilities, and everything down to like the floor is within that envelope. So it's been a very cost-effective facility for the scale that we're operating at. And that's just because we've essentially done everything ourselves and kind of thrown out a lot of standard engineering approaches, which were never fit for purpose and are especially not fit for purpose in food.
Did you look at some of what the other big cultivated meat companies had done with their pilot
Yes.
production plants to say, hey, that works. That's not a great idea, and build yours? Did you benefit a little bit by going a little bit later?
I don't. I mean, maybe a little bit. I already had a very strong view that the way companies were operating and thinking about facility design was not fit for purpose. So
Hmm.
that was reinforced when I started to see some of the facilities that were being built. And it's kind of every layer of the facility design and operational design is they're designed as clean rooms. It's like the energy cost of operating that as a clean room with HVAC is that immediately kills your unit economics. And then each unit operation is done in the way it's done in pharma. And so it requires two operators, and then you need a team of 5 on the floor to run one set of bioreactors. And it's like, well, then your labor costs mean you're never tenable. And it always seemed to me like the only way to make this work was to go back to first principles. I assumed someone else was going to do that. So originally, if I would have opened up some of our early pitch decks, it's like we're going to do the upstream R&D and product development, and then the marketing, and we'll contract manufacture everything in between. And it became very apparent that the only contract manufacturer in the space didn't understand the economics, and
Hmm.
nor did they have the ambition or desire to make the economics viable. And so we sort of became a manufacturer by necessity. And that's become the area where I think, just because of persistent risk taking and a tolerance of first principles engineering, we've managed to make a lot of progress. Kind of an
Is the
interesting.
space still like that though? Is it has have we learned? Are there people, maybe contract manufacturers? I mean, there's also like new guys like prolific machines trying to do new approaches to bioreactors. Or are we learning? Do you think the space has moved forward enough, or do you still think like you guys are doing it right? No one else is really doing it right.
I mean, a short answer is it feels like we're the only ones taking this approach. I mean, you can see the public information around Believer's facility is out there. They're working with very conventional contractors. And we know from speaking with similar contractors that yes, they may wind back the requirements 10% from pharma, but you need to wind them back 90%. And so there's a real lack of willingness. There seems to still be a lack of willingness to take the level of in process risk that I think is necessary to make the economics viable. So we've seen this sort of interesting uptick recently of other companies approaching us to
Hmm.
ask about contract manufacturing. We've got the capacity, we're selling continuously, and we do have some excess capacity that we can provide to other companies. So we've got a few projects underway at the moment, which has been a very interesting insight into how other philosophies have played out.
What does your end product look like in terms of what am I eating? Because when I've had cultivated meat, like the one time, first of all, I had to sign a contract basically saying if I die of cancer, you can't sue them. But also, it was like maybe 1% something from a bioreactor. The rest was like plant based. So it was very little actually cultured meat cells in the actual product. What does yours look like? Is it still primarily plant based with a little bit of cultured meat? Are you using some precision fermentation based inputs there?
No, so the majority of so all the products we have on market, well, I mean the two main products being the parfait and the foie gras, both of those are majority cells. I think the foie is about 52% cells, with most of the balance made up by a plant-based fat system. And then the parfait is 70% cells, with the balance mostly made up with butter, olive oil, and then the veg mix, which is garlic, thyme, eschalots. I think that's it. Olive oil. um, so I have a view. My view has always been this is not an ingredient. It's not a flavor, even though it could be used as a flavor or a masking agent. That's not the function that it should have in food. This, to solve the problem that I think needs to be solved, needs to be the protein source. It needs to be the thing which makes up the bulk, ideally 100% of the food that you're eating, not 1% with some TVP. That's not actually doing anything. That's a marketing story.
Yeah, that's great. And I kind of am aligned with you on that belief because, yeah, if you're just sprinkling on some cells for flavor, I think so many people got into this business and created this industry as a way to create a more sustainable source of animal protein and not kind of essentially displace the animal agriculture. And you're not going to really do it if you're doing it that old way. But
Exactly.
looking forward, if you're thinking about where you take this company from here, Australia, New Zealand would be great. Are you thinking globally? Do you want to come to the US? What's next after that?
I mean, definitely thinking globally. We're working with regulators everywhere from Europe, the UK, through to the Middle East, through to other countries in Asia, through to South America. We have an engagement in Africa now, so it's like we are working with regulators all over the world, and we will be aiming to bring product to market all over the world. We have been working with both the US regulator and the Canadian regulator. How do I say this politely? I wouldn't bet on anything in the US right now, and so while
Hmm.
we will
I
continue
wonder
to do our
why.
best, while we'll continue to do our best with the FDA, we're definitely not relying on the US. It's just a unpredictable time to be building a business where the US is a key pillar right now.
Well, that's super exciting. You've hinted at some future types of food products. Do you think the way you're doing it, if other people use your approaches, could we get to grocery store level pricing in 5 years, 10 years? Or when can I go to like a grocery store here in the U.S. and buy cultivated meat products that are not hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but are more affordable?
I mean, the short answer is sooner than that. So we're going to be testing in retail this year, and that will be a price point which you'd expect to see in not a Walmart, but like a Whole Foods. We've achieved those sort of unit economics already, and the goal is to come down and be the cheapest protein source in the long term. So it's not where we're at today. There's still a bunch of scale up and reliability risk that we need to work through. But the process is yielding. We get very, very high yields, very cheap media, and we've proven all of this can integrate at large scales. And it's now about making sure we can do that time after time after time after time, and then we can utilize that at 100%. And doing those things gets us to grocery store prices. There's not more technology to develop. It's just about putting it all together and just running it.
George Peppou, Vow, where can people find out more about you guys?
Start with our website, eatvow.com, or much more fun is forgedbyvow.com, which is the food brand we have in market right now.
All right. I look forward to sometime trying it, either in overseas and maybe you'll bring it to the US at some point. Thanks, George.
Thanks, Mike.